Terrific. All right. Welcome to everybody in the room. Welcome to everybody viewing this from wherever you are. We're absolutely delighted today to have, I'm going to pronounce it wrong again, Shoaib.
Yes.
Shoaib Rahim. I think Randall and I were pronouncing his name incorrectly. At least I led you down the garden path
I was referring to you
for a while. There you go. Who is going to be talking to us today about the Doha Agreement and how the United States failed Afghanistan. In a way, it's a story that is well known to many, tragically so. But Shoaib is in a particularly is in a unique position to comment on some of the inner workings of this and to give credence to some of our maybe suspicions or otherwise, right? Having been involved in this. He currently is the acting chair of the business department at the American University of Afghanistan and a visiting research scholar and also associate professor of practice in management at AUA and a visiting research scholar at the New School for Social Research in, is it still called the New School for Social Research, or is it just the New School?
It's, well, that's the department. NSSR is the.
Oh, okay. In New York, but has come to Canada. So you're obviously a non-resident scholar at the New School. He's somebody with obviously a wealth of practical experience on the ground, having been the acting mayor of Kabul. Unlike certain presidents who were claimed to be the mayor of Kabul, he was actually the mayor of Kabul. And more recently, and up until the time when he, along with many others, fled the country in August of last year, he was senior advisor to the State Ministry for Peace, where he supported the negotiation team of Afghanistan in peace negotiations in Doha, Qatar. And the World Cup is happening in Qatar, so that might be particularly painful to see this.
What World Cup? I don't know.
There's a World Cup, right? Exactly, that's happening. He's also a terrific human being and an analyst of the highest order. We hope to have him involved more in the monk school if possible. He speaks multiple languages fluently and is a deeply reasonable analyst of current affairs, including those concerning his home country. I wish we could have you here under entirely different circumstances, but we live with the circumstances that we live with, and under those circumstances, we're delighted to have you here and to hear your insights about Doha. So welcome to Toronto.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that very, very kind and undeserving introduction. Thank you, Ed. Thank you to Sirius and Asian Institute for setting this up. Good morning, everyone, in person and online. I thought long and hard about the approach I wanted to take in this talk today. And a lot of it depended on the internal demons that many former public officials in Afghanistan deal with. The sense of guilt, the sense of failure, the sense of responsibility that anyone with a soul or a conscience would face is immense. In the past year and a half after the collapse, many have been struggling to deal with this, and I am no exception to that. But with that said, what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to make this a conversation which is useful and a conversation which I believe is extremely relevant to Canada, but also to the world, particularly in the ongoing conflicts, as well as Afghanistan itself. So with that in mind, I want to start off and take a few minutes to talk about the relevance of Afghanistan in the past 40-odd years of global history, starting from the 79 Soviet invasion, not very much unlike what is happening today in Ukraine, very, very comparable. Afghanistan became the centerpiece of a lot of superpower games. And then in the 90s, after the collapse of the communist socialist state. We had the 90s. Well, that resulted in the Berlin Wall's collapse in a way. The 90s, where the Taliban took over, late 90s, ended with September 11th. And then the past 20 years, the whole world was present in Afghanistan, but unfortunately was not able to make that presence sustainable. And for a variety of reasons, we are almost, we can say, back at square one, as if the Taliban never left. But what I'd like to always state to anyone interested in Afghanistan is that Afghanistan always has a way of creeping back to relevance. So if you're a student of international relations, if you're a student of global affairs, if you want to understand how the world works, whether you like it or not, you usually can't avoid a conversation on Afghanistan. And so with that said, there's also a specific connection of Canadian armed forces, NATO in general being present in the past 20 years, committing troops on the ground, and the development aspect. And so the past 2 decades created this very deep link between various groups inside Afghanistan and in the region and the world, which makes this collapse even more tragic. One final piece that I want to say before getting into the topic is that these are my points of view based on my experience. I was working very closely involved in the peace process starting 2019. I was involved in the formation of the negotiation team. I was involved in preparation for the Doha talks. I was one of the people who were involved in the mechanics of the peace infrastructure in the state of Afghanistan. But I do not represent anyone. This is just how I see it, how I analyze it. And so what essentially I'm trying to say is feel free to question and disagree as much as possible. That's completely okay and very much welcome. So with that introduction, I wanted to frame today's conversation. Please feel free to ask questions or guide the conversation any way you feel interested. I wanted to structure the talk today into 3 sections. First, to set up the pre-Doha context, because we will not appreciate the gravity of the mistakes done in this agreement without understanding the context in which it actually took place and decisions that were made. So I'm going to take some time talking about the pre-Doha agreement context. The second part, I'll talk about the Doha agreement itself and some highlights. And the third section, I'll talk about the impact of that agreement and how it affected the war, essentially resulting in the collapse that we all saw. People, when they think of Afghanistan and the collapse, everyone remembers the very tragic scenes at the airport with the planes and the herds of people. And so those are the scenes that people remember, but what people don't see is what happened in the backdrop. And so I'm gonna divide my talk into these 3 sections. And one last thing before getting into the context is that I've chosen this topic, this title, very deliberately. But what this title does not mean is that this title does not absolve anybody else from this collapse. This issue of US abandoning Afghanistan puts sufficient responsibility on the United States, on the part of the United States, but in no way, shape, or form absolves the government of Afghanistan, primarily former President Ashraf Ghani, or the Dr. Abdullah, partner of the government. In no way, shape, or form absolves us as a society. In no way, shape, or form absolves all the other non-US regional players and global players who through a series of decisions, unfortunately got us where we are. And so with that said, I have very, very well-informed friends entering the room. So if I put my foot out of line, we have a lot of people to correct me. So let's start off. And Ed, I'm not sure how the format goes, but I am very much interested in having a conversational style rather than a monologue. So feel free to interject if anyone has questions. I feel much more comfortable now with my very established journalist friends who always put tough questions to me over the past years, as well as Ms. Zoha. So please intervene when you feel it's necessary. So what was the context of Afghanistan up until 2018? And the way I want to describe this context is by looking at the role different stakeholders had, because different stakeholders are relevant to different members of the audience. I'm just focusing on this talk. So I'm going to talk about the battlefield realities. I'm going to talk about what was happening in Washington up until that time. I'm going to talk about what was happening in Kabul and the presidential palace by 2018. I'm going to talk about the region, the position of the Russians, the Iranians, the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Chinese, and the Europeans. And with this setup, I hope to clarify and take us back to that time. So the reactions of the people when a lot of decisions were made is understood a bit clearer. So in 2018, Afghanistan has 34 provinces. None of the 34 provinces across the country were controlled by the Taliban. They were all controlled by the government. The territorial control of the country, which was a contested and disputed map. Ambassador Mawani. Morning. The territorial control, which was disputed in 2018, was about 20 to 25% of the districts were fully controlled by the Taliban. Around 40% of the districts were fully controlled by the government, and the remainder was disputed with a strong Taliban presence, but the control kept on switching between sides. The Afghanistan National Security Forces were completely had the lead of the war efforts. The United States continued to provide air support, continued to provide training, advising, and assisting. NATO's advisors were on the ground. The intelligence capabilities were there, and the battlefield itself was such that there was no sense that the Taliban had any advantage per se. The fear at that time was mostly driven by the polarized politics by the politicians in Kabul, where Ashraf Ghani had become president after a massively disputed and fraudulent election, forming a national unity government. And after the formation of that government, unfortunately, the politics became extremely polarized. And so what we had an extremely defiant president who isolated himself, took on everybody else, and his calculation was that I am Washington's guy. You can't touch me. I have the US support, and so feel free to do as you please. And for the most part, it worked. For the most part, he consolidated power, he consolidated financial resources, and he consolidated the chain of command of the security forces. So that's the battlefield, and that's Kabul. What was happening in Washington? Trump had promised to end the war. Trump had, among many of his promises, said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And so as a part of his commitment, And this is the question mark. This is the part where everybody's still speculating. Hopefully down the line, if a few of those people write honest books, we will know. But there was a decision. To directly start secret talks with the Taliban in Doha without anybody knowing. And when I say anybody, I mean not the government of Afghanistan, and to a large extent, the non-US NATO allies. We worked very closely with Germany, with the British, and their level of engagement was minimal, if not nothing. Whether they knew or not, or whether they were brought in the loop down the line, we don't know. The region at that point had a consensus to make life hard for NATO in Afghanistan. What does that mean? We have documented reports of Russians supplying the Taliban with AK-47s, weaponry, ammunition, and intelligence when it comes to their territorial advances in the north. Iranians were actively hosting and training an entire section and faction of the Taliban. They had a Mashhad Shora, which is a major Iranian city in the border, and where Mullah Brother is associated with. Mullah Brother was, one of the Times top 100 influential people. And so, when you hear of propped up individuals, Mullah Brother is one of them. And so the Iranian involvement with the Taliban, Iranians had a hedging policy. They engaged the government, worked with the government, but also had relationships with the Taliban in terms of funding and resources. Pakistan was, the hotbed of Taliban's insurgency. Their ability to revert back, rearm themselves, retrain themselves, and enter back into the theater allowed them to continue fighting for 20 years. And so Pakistan's role was clear. India was very much in line with the palace and was on the Republic side, quote unquote, and continued its proxy agenda through those relationships. So that's how the region was in Afghanistan. The Chinese engagement in Afghanistan was and continues to be directed and guided by the Pakistanis. The Chinese don't necessarily have an independent agenda in Afghanistan, as far as I was aware and engaged and involved. Chinese interests are primarily to contain the Uyghur rebels based in northeastern Afghanistan, and they've done the same in Pakistan. But a lot of their intelligence and military positioning was around that. But the government's ability to engage the Chinese was heavily restricted by the Americans and by NATO. So Trump had made that commitment and had a decision to figure something out. Nothing is working. Let's get something going. So that is the context. So what actually happened? What happened was that in 2018, secret talks began. And we know this in hindsight that it was 2018. We don't have specifics. These records are not public yet. But what happened was that the United States started these talks and essentially started negotiating terms of withdrawal. With the enemy, with the Taliban. So the equivalent of that would be, that in itself is quite understandable, but the equivalent of that would be if the Americans are not active, they kind of are in Ukraine, but if they would just reach an understanding and stop funding, stop arms support, stop everything in Ukraine, and just say, well, good luck, all the best. And so what happened was that there were rounds and rounds of negotiations that took place in Doha with some suspicion that there is movement. When Ashraf Ghani realized that there are negotiations taking place, there was a massive public stance and opposition that the government took against this, saying that the Afghanistan government is being delegitimized, that you're bypassing us, we are your signed partners, we have a bilateral security agreement, we are a member of SOFA. signed back in 2014, which gives us this strategic partnership. These documents have to mean something. But apparently they didn't. And so those cries of foul play did not get anywhere. And that was the palace's reaction. When talks of Doha were made public, the general impression of the local power brokers, so there's a Kabul elite, and then there's the local power brokers and commanders on the field who are with the government supporting, gathering intelligence and making sure the Taliban are at bay. Afghanistan's public consciousness was suddenly taken back to the Geneva Accords, where under the umbrella of a peace process, the superpower of the time very conveniently set up its own exit. And negotiating that process had very little to do with the political powers inside Afghanistan. It had a lot to do with the general grand scheme of things. And so what people remembered was that, well, the peace process was signed, and then the government eventually collapsed in 2 years, 3 years. We were not able to sustain ourselves. So people became extremely sensitive to, okay, what is going on? And so in Doha, the mechanism of the US during the negotiations was that parallel to this, American Air Force had completely started bombarding and aggressively forcing the Taliban, increasing US leverage on the negotiating table. The amount of Taliban casualties in 2019 was extremely high. A lot of gains were made. And this goes to show, to an earlier conversation, we were saying that, the Americans only give that much support and that much intelligence and that much ammunition for the war to continue. Not enough to win and get it over with. And so what we saw in 2019 was a very strong push. We did not know, as in the understanding was not there, that the purpose behind this ramp up was the agreement in Doha to get better terms. And the president of Afghanistan, the partner, and the other politicians led by Dr. Abdullah, who was also 50% more or less of the government, were briefed what was going on in Doha. Every 3-4 weeks, the envoys, Al-Mai Khalilzad, used to fly in for a day or two, make the rounds, give some half-hour, 1-hour remarks and briefs, and then just go back. So we had no visibility of what was happening, what was being discussed. A lot of times, the top journalists in Afghanistan, 2 of which are in this room, had more information and more updates on what was going on in Doha compared to the government. And so it was an extremely bleak situation in terms of what was being agreed and negotiated. At the end, the document that was signed on 29 September 2020, which is known as the Doha Deal, or the agreement for bringing peace in Afghanistan. I have a copy of it here. So highlighted some parts I'd like to read out to you. Was signed, and the document that was circulated, the agreement was circulated, and it had secret annexes, and I'll get to the secret annex part and the implications that the secret annex had. The agreement was essentially formed of 4 parts between the United States and the Taliban directly as signatories. Pompeo was present from the US side, Zalmay Khalilzad signed it. Mullah Baradar, head of the Taliban Political Commission in Doha, was the counter-signatory to this agreement. So I have a few of these. I wanted to read out some of the text to you because the focus is Doha Deal, so it's good for you to get some of the text of the actual agreement. Now let's read verbatim, then we'll have the conversation. Okay, Article 1. Guarantees and enforcement mechanisms that will prevent the use of the soil of Afghanistan by any group or individual against the security of the United States and its allies. Article 2. guarantees enforcement mechanisms and announcement of a timeline for the withdrawal of all foreign forces from Afghanistan. Article 3, after the announcement of guarantees for a complete withdrawal of foreign forces and timeline in the presence of international witnesses, and guarantees and the announcement in the presence of international witnesses that Afghan soil will not be used against the security of the US and its allies, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is not recognized by the United States as a state and is known as the Taliban, will start intra-Afghan negotiations with Afghan sides on March 10, 2020. Article 4, a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire will be an item of the agenda of the intra-Afghan dialogue and negotiations. The participants of intra-Afghan negotiations will discuss the date and modalities of a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire, including joint implementation mechanisms, which will be announced along with the completion and agreement over the future political roadmap of Afghanistan. So this is essentially the highlight of the agreement. Now, what does this mean? This means that the Americans and the Taliban, and when I say the Taliban cannot utter a word, could not and still cannot utter a word without Rawalpindi's approval, without Pakistan's green light, without their okay. So the negotiations were actually happening with Pakistan, as was in 88. In 88, Pakistan was an actual signatory to the Geneva Accords, right? So, I mean, that's the elephant in the room, that's there, right? No one is denying it now. That's just part of it. So what this agreement essentially meant was that we're going to leave in 14 months, and we're going to 100% commit to this. And in return, what we expect from you, the Taliban, is that you will start negotiations. That's it. There's nothing else of value for the people of Afghanistan or for the process. And so what we got from the Americans was a whole bunch of arm twisting, a lot of political pressure. Our entire constitutional order, with all its flaws, with all its problems, was being dumped down the drain because the Taliban are now willing to sit with you. No more guarantees are given, and that's good enough. So if you were the Taliban, if you were sitting across the table, you're getting a pretty good deal. The world, NATO, US, you're essentially defeating a global power, and they're leaving in 14 months, and you don't actually have to do anything. There was strategic ambiguity, the term that was thrown around. Zalmay Khalilzad is a genius. Strategic ambiguity in the language. And what he told everybody else was that, oh no, I have assurances. So everybody looked at the same text, but people understood completely different, took away different meanings from this text. So the strategic ambiguity, where is the strategic ambiguity? So when the agreement says that the Taliban will not allow the soil of Afghanistan to be used against the US and its allies, what does that actually mean? Nobody knew what it actually meant. What does that commitment entail? How do you do it? Is that clarified? Is that clarified in the secret annexes? We don't know. In reality, we did not see any such engagement taking place, any such commitment taking place, and I'll get to that in the last section. And so a document was signed, and because the palace was uncomfortable, there was a counter statement that came out on the same day of the Doha Agreement, which didn't really mean anything. And the bilateral security agreement and the SOFA, which is a big deal for NATO, and it was a big deal for us. We had a whole national consensus happening around it, around signing it. It was a big deal for us to become a strategic ally of the US and NATO. None of that mattered. So when it comes to international law, or when it comes to international relations, one after the other, we saw signed documents completely lose relevance and meaning. They did as they pleased. And we as a system were at their mercy. Now, I'm not saying that the government of Afghanistan did not have its flaws, did not make mistakes, could have done better. There were better routes, 100%. But we had our hands tied behind our back, and we were given an extremely, extremely bad deal. One final element, and let me get to the secret annexes, then one other issue, I'll get to the third section. The Doha Agreement contained a secret annex. As far as I haven't seen it, many people keep asking me, have you seen it? I have not seen it. I am not sure if this, as far as I know, Ashraf Ghani did not see it. As far as I'm aware. Dr. Abdullah didn't see it. Did he see it? Okay. He didn't see it, as far as I know. The secret annex was a very important and very important element of this agreement. The message it sent to our security forces and to the region was that, oh, now the Taliban are America's boys. Now the Taliban are going to do a US bidding in Afghanistan because they have these secret deals. Who knows what they've agreed to? The speculation, well, a few things happened which lead to speculation of what the secret annexes contain. First is intelligence sharing of what goes on the battlefield. Second is military coordination. There was a joint military coordination cell formed in Doha with representative from US CENTCOM, Central Command, and a member of the Taliban sitting together and talking about the battlefield. And the strategic partner, which was perhaps the only victim, the only party in this story who you can say was a good guy, is those brave men across the country who kept on risking their lives to protect our cities, our villages, and our country, and they were betrayed. They were not a party to this. So speculation is that it was for intelligence sharing, speculation it was because for military coordination, and also it provided some detail and assurance that the Taliban would provide safe passageways, provide secure corridors for when the US troops move from regional bases inside the country to Kabul to fly out. Those commitments were made. Mind you, an all-out war is still going on in Afghanistan with the enemy. And all of a sudden, the enemy has a secret deal with your biggest partner and your biggest supporter and your biggest donor. The day this agreement was signed, air support for our commandos and our troops in Afghanistan stopped. And because our forces were trained over the past 2 decades to be heavily dependent on air support, this drastically reduced our ability to conduct and take the battle to the Taliban and to the enemy. That's one. Second, the supply line and logistics, which is making sure that ammunition and weapons arrive and we have the ability to defend, were hampered. All of a sudden, they were like, okay, good luck. You do it yourselves. Military supply chain and logistics is extremely complicated. We were not trained. Afghanistan, I have spent a few years in the Ministry of Defense as well, from defense to peace, the irony of Afghanistan. We were not trained because of whatever reason. And this made us extremely dependent. This dependency made us weak. And I see the same strategy and the same form of dependencies happening right now in the Ukraine war theater, right? But that's a story for the end of the conversation. And so our commandos, our security forces, after the signing of the Doha Agreement, were literally weakened. Our ability to gather intelligence and information, our ability to intervene enemy's movements was compromised. We went into a position called active defense, right? These are all euphemisms. I'm sharing these I'm sharing my observations because you're going to hear a lot of these euphemisms again in Ukraine sooner or later. Unfortunately, it's a part of the lingo. So active defense, it meant that you saw the enemy breaching the agreement, you saw the enemy attacking. You were not explicitly told not to attack, but in reality, you were hampered enough. If you knew that you went on with that operation, your casualties would be high and you would not make that calculation anymore. The region understood the secret annex to be very dangerous to them. And so the other side effect of this agreement immediately was that everybody wanted to be buddies with the Taliban now. They're the new boys in town. They're the ones who are going to steal the show now. So they were invited for talks. These are, by the way, UN sanctioned individuals on no-fly lists. They were still on no-fly list. There were some exemptions for a few of the individuals, but not all of them. They were invited for very lavish, high protocol meetings in Tehran, in Beijing, in Tashkent, in Moscow. And all of a sudden, this insurgency was converted into a political process, a political group, a political entity, and treated as at the same level as a legitimate state, as a state with functioning pillars, recognition, seat at the UN General Assembly, etc. So let's get to the last section. How did the signing of the Doha Agreement change things? The biggest impact it had was on battlefield dynamics. It affected battlefield dynamics on two levels. First was it hampered our national army's ability to take the fight to the Taliban. That's one. We talked about that. The second thing it did, and this is what I think, this is the calculation that was in a blind spot, a policy blind spot, or maybe it was deliberate, depending on who you speak and how much conspiracy theories they believe in, they'll give you their answers. But essentially, the local commanders across the country realized that the winds of change are coming. So they were allied with the government, they were partnered with the government, they provided information, access to the national army in areas which are under threat. Doha Agreement was signed. America kept on saying, we're leaving. They said, okay, well, we've seen this story before, and we're smart this time. We're not going to lose out. So what did they do? They started hedging. They started reaching out, hey, Taliban, let's talk. Right? Hey, Corps commander in the west of the country, in the north of the country, we're with you, don't worry, but let's talk. Everybody tried to secure their own individual interest. And so the battlefield dynamics completely shifted. And what happened was that we saw the casualty rate of our special forces skyrocket. It went high. Casualties were high because the quality of information and the support that was there before started crumbling down. So that's the battlefield. Politically, and this is where a lot of the blame is laid on our political class. Politically, we had a mixture of denial, where people said, US is not leaving. US has been promising that they're leaving for the past decade. They're not going to leave. Afghanistan is too important. Afghanistan is a strategic asset to the United States. We are at the crossroads. Ego kicks in. America is not going to leave. These are not conversations in corner shops and restaurants and cafes I'm referring to. These are conversations that are happening inside the palace with president and vice president and cabinet level members. So I'm talking actual policy level decision making. Denial was a big part of it. People still did not believe that the Americans will actually leave. They were meant to actually leave in 2011, didn't happen. 2014, didn't happen. So they were like, what's different now? Nothing's different now. One. Second, the political class saw this, that, oh, this is our chance to get back at Ashraf Ghani, who's been sidelining us. So everybody got together and said, yay, Doha deal, yay, Doha deal, yay. We're going to replace Ashraf Ghani. His leadership was so toxic, was so polarizing, that it completely blinded the political rivals to the big picture. What if the Taliban come? The Taliban won't come. Don't worry. We've beaten them before. We're going to do it again. So the political leadership and the bubble in Kabul became dysfunctional. And what does that mean? That meant that we did not have a plan B. As a system, we did not have a plan B as a country. What are we actually going to do when the Americans leave? Nobody knew. The level of dependency had become so strong, and we had lost so much agency that we were completely dependent on the whims of what would happen. And this very ambiguous, strategically ambiguous text. So the Doha Agreement had that impact. US started arm twisting. 5,000 Taliban prisoners were forced to be released by the government. 5,000 Taliban prisoners. 5,000 is not, we're not talking about 5 people. We're not talking about 50 people. 5,000, it's an entire brigade in some armies. Right? It was not even mentioned here. It's not a part of the agreement. But Zalmay Khalilzad said, I committed to them and I have to. Taliban were like, you told us. We were standing there having green tea. You told us. And so Ashraf Ghani resisted, but his resistance was not, now we know in hindsight, his resistance was not on principle. His resistance was, okay, I'll give it to you. What am I going to get in exchange? Oh, come and attend. I have to make the negotiating team. Oh, you have to come and attend my presidential inauguration. Oh, you have to ensure this happens, secure my continuous of power. So the 5,000 were released. That completely boosted the Taliban offensive across the board. 5,000 hardcore, ideological, capable fighters, commander level.
But there was an exchange element, right? Wasn't there? Didn't he get some 1,000 or something like that?
We got the actual numbers that I remember were less than 800, and the list was never actually verified. So the Taliban started around hijacking people, and they said, here are your commanders. There was a joint commission to vet the lists. And our ministry was a member of that commission. And so it didn't change. It completely played into their hands. So what happened, and I'm going to start wrapping it up now. What happened was Trump lost. When Trump lost, I was in Doha. The tone of the Taliban across the table completely shifted. For the first time in months, we saw genuine fear that they don't know what's going to happen. Because before that, what we were getting in the negotiating room was that we're just here because we signed an agreement with the Americans. You're a puppet army. You're nobody. We've signed a deal with your masters. And so, us and our negotiators would be angry. Oh, look at them. We have to do this. We have to do that. But nothing. We didn't actually have the ability. We had no leverage because the leverage was signed away already. When Trump lost, we were in a deadlock. In Doha, we were in a deadlock. We kept on proposing alternatives. And I'm not going to get into the details of the deadlock, but we kept on providing alternatives. But the Taliban kept on dragging their feet and pushing on the war front. When Trump lost, the Taliban called us. Hey, why don't you come over for dinner? They initiated resolution of the deadlock because they wanted to they didn't want to lose the Doha deal and Biden to say the Taliban are not genuine, we're walking away from the deal. And so Biden started an overall review of the Doha deal on what to do. And there was a study done, the Afghanistan study group, a congressionally mandated study, which provided alternatives and policy options. The recommendation that it had to Biden specifically was that you need to make this agreement conditional. You need to condition withdrawal on actual results in the negotiations, on a political agreement. A. B, you need to reassert that we are still with the government, because the Americans had, and this commission realized that this deal had completely undermined. And then they said, okay, that was a recommendation. They provided alternative pathways. Walk away from the Doha deal and continue this course. Close your eyes and just withdraw. Third option was that calculated withdrawal. Keep the embassy, keep some force, residual force, but withdraw. So, there were a lot of folks who were involved in that study group. People were consulted, but it was a congressionally mandated. It was an American report, and it was a reasonable report. Biden read that report and threw it in a dumpster. And he went behind the podium and said that we are withdrawing from Afghanistan on September 11th, 2021, which later became August, end of August. And that's it, done. Afghans have to do it themselves. This is a great army we've built for them. The special forces are going to take care of everything. We're going to send in money. Bada bing, bada boom, all is well. This is no Vietnam, and life is good. That was the nail in the coffin. After that, we saw the pace of districts collapsing increase. By July, provincial collapses had begun, and in August, in a span of 2 weeks, we saw pretty much 30 provinces, provincial capitals collapse. Only Kabul was left. On August 15th, when the fight was coming to Kabul still had 30,000 forces. Political stakeholders were there. Everybody was focused on what's going to happen. Doha had converted at some point from a negotiation deal to a surrender deal. In this process, our negotiators in Doha had started negotiating a surrender deal without anybody knowing, or with very few people knowing. And so imagine you send people to the front line and you have hundreds of body bags coming in daily, weekly. And you're in Doha talking about surrender, and you're saying, no, we're good, keep fighting. And so cometh, what's the saying? Cometh the man, cometh the hour, cometh the man. And so cometh the hour, cometh the man. All of a sudden, people realize that Ashraf Ghani is on a helicopter and he's disappeared. And that completely collapsed any potential for meaningful engagement or any sort of possible political solution to happen. It was an all-out failure. Now, this is, depending on who you ask, some would say, oh no, the reason behind Ashraf Ghani leaving, which I personally think is the most cowardly act anyone could do, and my head and the millions of our citizens, our heads are down in shame because of his flight and escape. But that's just, if you ask his staunch supporters, no. We kept the integrity of the palace and the presidency by not allowing the president to become hostage to the Taliban. To be fair, in 1992, when Najib's government collapsed, the last socialist government of Afghanistan, that was the reference point. And when the Taliban took Kabul in 95, he was protected in the UN office. It took him out, tortured him, and hanged him. So that was we don't want Ashraf Ghani to become like that. So when Ashraf Ghani fled, panic, Kabul went into chaos. This is also in dispute, what I'm about to tell you in August 15. Whether the Taliban breached because they had committed not to enter Kabul, whether the Taliban breached Kabul, or whether the Taliban entered Kabul after Ashraf Ghani had fled and after being invited in. The Taliban would, of course, that's their story. The story is that we did not breach the Doha agreement, we did not enter Kabul. But that is yet to be proven. 4 collapses, for our book, we're looking at all the collapses. 4 collapses, each collapse, there's a public commitment not to enter Kabul, but forces enter Kabul. It happened in 2001 with the Northern Alliance. It happened in 96. It happened in 92. So this is disputed. And then Kabul collapsed on August 15th. And in the evacuation, there was a bomb attack and 13 US Marines were killed by the Haqqanis, but of course they didn't do it. It was ISIS. They didn't do any of it the past 20 years, by the way. It was all ISIS, just so we're clear on that. And the US, the final plane left Afghanistan on August 31st. And what we are left with is an extreme distrust of any resolution or commitment or promise that is set to us by Western organizations. And I think that we are to blame for not learning from our own history after the Soviet withdrawal and repeating the same mistakes. And so I'll stop.
There's so much to talk about. That's such a rich presentation, and as promised, analytically fruitful, but also personal and with an insider's perspective. We may have some questions from the online audience. Feel free to put something in there should be a button at the bottom, and we'll get to those questions as we can. Also, anybody in the room, just raise your hand, and I'll take a list as we go forward. Let me start it off with a particular question that partially answered, but I still find myself puzzled by it. Right. So, having some glancing familiarity with Afghan history, as I do, it would seem that the history of Afghanistan rebuffing, foreign powers or being abandoned or being left at some point would have and should have loomed large over this over the Ghani sort of period, right? And I still wonder where that total blindness to the possibility of Washington leaving, right, came from. I mean, you mentioned sort of hubris or egoism or this kind of thing. I'm Washington's man, which is, I suppose, I mean, that may seem to be secure, but the history of being Washington's man in Latin America or anywhere else might not guarantee, stability. So what's going on in such that they were entirely blind to this possibility? And put differently, thinking about the sort of a counterfactual, what kind of planning might have been done for Washington's eventual withdrawal? Was the problem here the rapidity, the sort of being blinded by developments, being surprised by developments? Surely it wasn't the fact that Washington was going to leave Afghanistan in the lurch. Just having spent a lot of time in other parts of Central Asia, everyone knows Washington leaves eventually, right? When its own interests dictate that it should. So I guess maybe fill in a little bit more of that story if there's anything else to say beyond, or maybe hubris and egoism is enough of an explanation.
I'd say 2 things to that question. I think it's a very important question. The first thing I'd say is that the US has and continues to have competing dynamics within it before a policy is made. You have one type of messaging coming out of the White House and the State Department. You have a different kind of messaging coming out of Pentagon. with military interests, you have a completely different type of messaging coming out of Langley and the intelligence community. And this messaging, they are not always consistent, and they're based on their own institutional priorities. And so it allowed, and this was reflected in the Cigar report, which came out, this allowed the Afghan side to pick and choose the message that suits them best. Because US Army generals kept on saying, we're with you, shoulder to shoulder. We're going to be with you till the end. Let's send in new support. Let's advance this. Let's train this. State Department was like, you guys need to prepare because we're leaving. And we're like, you're not leaving. They just committed to another $5 billion for the next 5 years. And so this kind of inconsistent messaging played a big role, in my opinion. That's one. Second is, if there was, I think if we had learned lessons from our past, this is again my opinion, people are free to judge it. I think we should have had a different approach when it came to our relationship with the region, because to the US, close relations with Tehran was a no-no. Iran is the enemy. Relations with Moscow, definitely no. And Beijing, we should have seen that and not burnt all bridges over the past 20 years. I also think we overinvested in our relationship in India. I think we pushed away Pakistan far too much because of India's friendship. And our Indian friends were the first embassy, were the first country to shut down their door to the people of Afghanistan on August 15th. And so I think a lot of the policy lines that we took over the years should have been different, and we should have fought for that greater autonomy in our relationship with the region.
Questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I believe being an Afghan and a student here at Monk will give me the privilege to ask 2 or 3 questions, if you're okay with that. My first question was around what do you think are the implications of the Doha Deal in the region, especially when it comes to Pakistan, and when it comes to the secret annexes? What do you think are the implications of that, or those secret annexes, and what does it mean for the people of Afghanistan, or the future of Afghanistan? And my second question was around currently in Afghanistan, we have a group, National Resistance Front, which is being led by Ahmed Massoud, who are fighting, or at least resisting, against the Taliban. And it has a form of more of a guerrilla type of war. But do you see any future for those resisting groups in Afghanistan? Do you see any regional powers or regional groups that might, in the future, support them?
Thank you. So
Before you go, I have a question about the secret annexes. It's actually quite a small, technical, but maybe important one. How do we know there are secret annexes? I mean, presumably somebody has seen them, or were they announced and trumpeted?
Yeah.
Because
they were announced. Yeah.
They were announced.
You mentioned in an interview. I think there was a congressional I think the Arms and Appropriation Committee or some such that they demanded it, and it was presented to them by the State Department. So it exists. People know it exists.
Yeah. Okay.
So thank you for that question. I think the Doha Deal unfortunately continues to legitimize the Taliban, is used currently as we speak as an excuse for the US and many countries to continue engaging the Taliban, even though the articles and the conditions and the commitments of this agreement were in no way, shape, or form respected. It's a dead deal but the fact that it hasn't been publicly denounced allows for some leeway for the US to continue engagement with the Taliban. There's an engagement philosophy, or we have to engage. We don't want the 90s to happen, because if we engage, we can contain and we can influence. Unfortunately, that logic is proving wrong, but that's up to being argued. And the secret annex also plays a big role, because it feeds the suspicion of the regional players that the Taliban were going to be weaponized against us. And so Russia's relationship with the Taliban and the region's relationship with the Taliban again becomes a, keep your friends close and enemies closer kind of thing. We want to be close to you because we don't want you to be used by the US or the West against us. Let's say the Iranians think this way. So the implications of this deal are still alive and kicking. But it has gone down in history as one of the worst foreign policy goof-ups, to be PG-13 in my terminology, since forever. And anybody associated with it has paid the price. And you mentioned Afghanistan to Biden, and he starts, let's talk about something that doesn't make my stomach churn. It's because of this specific agreement. So I think students of international affairs and political science need to look into this document, because it gives us a very scary snapshot of the decision-making process in Washington and how bad it can get. The Doha Agreement, before it was signed, the National Security Advisor of the time, Bolton, was not allowed to read it. Zalmay Khalilzad gave him the document, took it back from him. The National Security Advisor of the President of the United States was not allowed to see this document. I mean, you think this stuff happens in movies, but it doesn't. It actually happened to us. So the implications of this deal and the annex, I think, are still very, very relevant. And on the final point, the issue of resistance, I think we have to put the issue of resistance in a historic context. The occupation narrative is very strong in Afghanistan. That's we've been trained, or for whatever reason, you can never conquer and occupy Afghanistan. It's a point of pride. I think it should not be. It might have been much better off as a commonwealth. I can go on the record and say that, but this pride in being one of the only countries not conquered, whatever that term means, has kept us where we are. But specifically when it comes to the Taliban, in '96, when they captured Kabul from a previous government. The Mujahideen government was operational, controlled among the different factions, but they created a united front to fight the Taliban all the way till 2001, and they recaptured after September 11th and the US support. The same actors are alive and relevant today to varying degrees. So when you hear resistance, people are taken back to the late 90s when resistance worked. It gave us that space to fight back. And so it gives people that chance to believe in that things might change. So the fact that the difference is that the resistance at that time controlled far more territory than today. Today, the resistance controls no territory, no single district, no single hilltop. But knowing the trajectory that the Taliban are going in, the internal issues, the regional dynamics, the fact that public dissent against the Taliban is increasingly growing. Just yesterday, we saw public floggings reintroduced. Public floggings in football stadiums reintroduced by the Taliban. Schools have been closed for over a year. Ethnic targeting, forceful displacement of people from across the country based on whatever ideology or agenda the Taliban might have. And so, it doesn't matter what the region thinks or what the world thinks necessarily. When it reaches a certain threshold, people will be ready for a change, and that's usually when change has happened in our recent history.
Other questions? Anybody? Please go ahead.
The first part of the question is, to what sense do you see the US engagement in Afghanistan for 2 decades as a part of its broader so-called global war on terror, which began after 9/11? While its main focus was Afghanistan, it wasn't limited to Afghanistan. The Middle East, later of Iraq, and so on. To what extent do you see that as that? And that has wound down. If you listen to General McKenzie, Kenneth McKenzie, the former head of CENTCOM, who's now with the Middle East Institute partially, he's saying that chapter has drawn to a close, that now the main challenge is Russia, the main challenge is China, and that 20-year period of the so-called war on terror is not fully over, but it's largely over. And so, and it was a horrible period, I think, for all parties concerned, for the US itself, for the regional countries, whether it's Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, I think for all of these countries, and Iran is related to that in a way. But I see that as a chapter that has drawn to a close. The first question is, do you see that in those terms? And if we were to look forward, to what extent could intellectuals and policy practitioners like yourself, who don't go to Afghanistan anymore because of the situation, just like I don't go to Iran right now, right? How can we still help the people there by directing some of the massive funding that existed, but it was part of a war effort? But how could some of these Western funds be regenerated and directed towards development efforts instead of just the military dimension? So that's the two-part question.
Thank you. On the first question, I think Afghanistan was at the forefront of the war on terror and continued to be until a massive policy shift and until the security threat was recategorized. And I think that's exactly the wording that Biden used to justify the withdrawal, that we no longer see the priorities have shifted. Now we have to look at China, et cetera, et cetera. And so our security forces, the US presence, and the entire war machinery was focused on identifying high value targets and taking them out. And that happened on a continuous basis over the past 20 years and with different levels of success and result. And of course, that was the main security basis for the continuous existence of the militaries in Afghanistan. For us, that threat is still a reality. It has not gone away. For us, that threat, like in the 90s, has now become worse because the Taliban provide a very convenient cover to their ideological brethren to recruit, train, and plan from Afghanistan, unlike what this document committed that they wouldn't do. And we know that the implications will be felt by the region. But if the US feels, well, that's too distant, too far away, I'm not touched by it, I have a different game to play, well, that is for the US to decide. But for us, the threat is it's much worse than it was before because we've lost the ability to deal with it. On the issue of how can we still help, well, that's a conversation that a lot of the new wave of the Afghan diaspora are having. I am looking at the Iranian diaspora in the community. I'm looking at a lot of the communities, intellectuals, scholars, former public officials, civil activists, and how they've been able to influence. I think my impression is that the ability to influence what's happening inside Afghanistan or Iranians, Iran, is far more than what we give credit. I think it's far more. In Afghanistan's case, Afghanistan is that fragile So the contexts are different. But the past 20 years, some would argue, was also heavily influenced by diaspora in our country. Maybe it would have been better if that did not happen.
Interesting. That's another.
But the dynamic between the diaspora and people. So now, so we and a lot of the people here. I mean, I've studied abroad. I've lived a lot of my life abroad, but I still don't hold any other citizenship. Right. I continue to hold the worst passport in the world, and so do many of my friends. That was a point of pride, because it's a matter of loyalty. It's a very rigid way of defining loyalty, but that's a separate conversation. But I think that dynamic is very, very powerful, because resource-rich countries here, you can influence a lot, basically. So that's something that we are constantly discussing in the country.
Yeah. You look like you might have a question.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. A question and a couple of observations, if I may. I did spend about 7 years in Afghanistan and had the pleasure and really privilege of working with Shoaib Saab when he was the mayor of Kabul. Very refreshing, I'd have to say, the sorts of things that we were able to work on. I think because of your openness and maybe willing to take some risks too. I mean, I thank you. I thought that you did a really great job in the way that you have explained the impact of the Doha Deal and the US abandonment of Afghanistan. Maybe a couple of observations. When the Doha talks, I'm going to call them talks because I don't even think there was any negotiation. When these talks were going on, and some Afghan colleagues and were coming back to sort of report back, at least to the international community, there was a certain amount of optimism. I mean, and I remember conversations where I'm talking at the Canadian Embassy and how, well, the Taliban are saying that women can be judges, but they cannot sit on any case that involves capital punishment. They can be in politics, they can enter political office, but they cannot be a prime minister. So those were some of those conversations that were going on, which were giving, I would say, kind of little bit of comfort that, oh, yes, these conversations are going on, which means that they are open to this. And so I'm kind of afterwards have been thinking about what was all that? Were the people who are in that room completely, and we know them and respect them, were they mesmerized, or were they completely looking at, maybe they were talking to the wrong people? We've talked about this before. Maybe they were the wrong people that on the Taliban side that they were talking to. And maybe then the regional side. Certainly what we were being told, even in private conversations with the regional players, particularly, big regional players, was that they were they wanted the occupiers to leave. They wanted Americans to go, but they wanted it to be done in a responsible way. I remember that ringing. And so what happened was not considered to be a responsible way. Now, fast looking at the future, what I'm picking up from Shoaib Saab, what you're saying is that the Taliban should not be trusted, and that talking to them, well, maybe let me back up. What I'm thinking of the huge humanitarian crisis which we have not talked about. But if you're talking of the big elephant in the room, that is huge now. So how do you suggest, because our organizations are all working there, but how do you suggest, what is a way forward? Is there a way forward? that you see, because otherwise it's very, very dismal. And people are dying, people are, and I'm thinking of, my personal commitment to girls' education is known. And at the same time, I'm thinking about the mothers that I've met and talked to, for whom the biggest concern was security, because they could not have any more of the men in their families die. And if I talked to them about girls' education, it was very important, but the first thing was stop the fighting. So sorry for that very long
Oh, no, thank you so much.
observation.
Me and Ambassador Mawani were our office, we were neighbors. Mayor's office and the Serena Hotel were beside each other. And so we had very fun conversations at times. I used to receive calls and I was like, okay, I need to get this done. Otherwise, I'm not going to be allowed into the Serena Hotel where a lot of events took place. Thank you for that. So I think the issue of engagement with the Taliban is now the big concern that many have. Unfortunately, and I think this is a tragedy, I think there needs to be a distinction between addressing the humanitarian concerns in Afghanistan versus legitimizing and empowering a totalitarian regime which will use any resources it can get to hurt the same people they're trying to feed. So I think that distinction is becoming harder and harder to make. And I think in a situation where there are no viable alternatives, and right now we practically don't have political alternatives as much, the international community has the option of either engage or walk away. And guess who else knows this? The Taliban do. And so all they do is they do whatever they want, and they're like, no one's going away, no one's going to do anything. You have to engage us, you have to send us money, you have to help these people. So the sense is that, well, the Taliban are holding the people hostage. And just the other day, the Taliban foreign minister said the world eventually will recognize us, you don't need to worry. And I think that recognition comes from the fact that the aid community is self-interested, I'm sorry to say, and I think Aga Khan Foundation is an exception when it comes to the way they've done things and implemented projects, much more long-term view. So I would put Aga Khan aside. But I think the aid community and a lot of the global development infrastructure is self-interested. The UN gets 20-30% admin cost fees. People get $40,000 a month salary 3 times a year, holidays anywhere in the world, and all they have to do is sit behind the computer and not really do much. And so that cycle continues. So that's a whole different broken aid system discussion. The other thing is that I think that people prioritize interests, and unfortunately, forced displacements, girls' education, targeted killing of journalists, judges, former security sector officials is not a priority for the West. That means that the West does not care. And so these are how we see it. At the same time, people need to eat. And winters are very harsh and cold. So it becomes an impossible situation. So I think the only thing we can do is try to recognize that we should not actively blind ourselves from the fact that these are individuals who are acting in good faith. They are not. The Taliban are not acting in good faith. So I think if the world has to engage, people will understand. But if the international community, and that's the direction they're going, is, oh, the Taliban are, they're so nice, tourists going taking selfies, everything is so much better, I can go to areas where I couldn't have gone before. The Taliban themselves never allowed, but no, that's not a part of the conversation. So everything is great, and you have people who are living in that country or are being affected, or the relatives and family are being arrested, tortured, and killed, saying, what are you talking about? It's that disconnect again. So it's a very tough situation. I think the humanitarian assistance is very much needed and welcomed, but there are ways of doing this. And I think the international community can do that.
So the ways of doing this would be verifiable steps that the Taliban needs to take in order for the aid money to continue to flow? Is that, I mean, in a
Yes.
similar way that
I
you were
mean,
saying was absent in the Doha?
You would think that that is a straightforward thing to do.
No, I realize it's
But-
technically
but-
complicated,
but-
but yeah.
No, I mean, that it's achievable.
Yeah.
But that's not what the international community asked of it. I think last month a report came out that $1 billion was spent in Afghanistan the past year.
Hmm.
Where was it spent? Nobody knows. Where's the breakdown? Who did it go to? World Food Program? Okay, where did it distribute it? Did it go? It went to the central bank? Okay, so what happened? The currency is stabilized. How much of that money? How much of it went to NGOs owned by the Taliban? How much of it went? How much of the resources were diverted to arm and train individual militias? Nobody knows. And so the only criticism that's there is make them accountable. Why aren't you making them accountable? That accountability is missing.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, it's that's the story of a lot of aid programs, as you know, when you talk about the self-interest, right? But this is in a particularly opaque environment, it becomes all the more important, but B sort of challenging. Is on the aid question or?
I had one last question.
Okay, really quick, because we have at least one online that I want to go ahead and throw in there.
Since I believe it was a month ago when one of the Russian representatives said that Afghanistan had become a breeding ground for approximately 21 terrorist groups. Do you think, although some may say it's a conspiracy theory, but nevertheless there is a theory that one of the main purposes or policies of the US has been to sort of turn Afghanistan again into a terrorist breeding ground to destabilize the Russian borders in the north?
I think that and the secret annex in that conversation is a genuine fear that the region has. And I think their response to it is to keep the Taliban as your friends as much as possible. So basically, it's working out for the Taliban very well. Everybody's afraid. And the Taliban have one foreign policy tool, and that is, we'll just open the gates. We're going to let these Tajik Islamic movement to enter Tajikistan. We're going to let the IMU enter Uzbekistan. We're not going to stop. And that's literally the engagement that happened. And so Uzbekistan is, oh, no. Here's electricity, here's trade, we're with you, it's all good. So out of fear, that's what happened. And so unfortunately, that's working for the Taliban, but that has a limit. When winds of change come again, for whatever reason, priorities shift. But in 2001, the Taliban entire military and governance structure collapsed in a day. In a day. Like when it came to it, was done. And similar to what happened in 2021, there were vast empty districts and provincial capitals with nobody to claim them. And so change of power in Afghanistan happens very aggressively and very abruptly. And that is the situation.
So there's a question online actually that sort of gets at this, asking about, and maybe it links to the broader question of resistance, but here notions of an Arab Spring type revolution, Arab uprisings, like what's the possibility of something like that happening? We're watching Iran in real time, experiencing this. It may not end up with regime change, but nonetheless, there's notable, not to say heroic, protests occurring that could turn into something like political change in that context. What's the probability, or put differently, under what conditions might it be thinkable that this could happen? What would it take?
So I think when you talk about Afghanistan, you have to take into account that we have had 43 years of war. 43 years of war. And so the war fatigue that the population has is incomparable to any other country or any other conflict. This is a generation being born into, our generation was born into a war. We grew up in a conflict. And we're still in the conflict, taking different shapes or forms. So the fact of expecting this sort of Arab Spring equivalent, I think, I don't think if it happens, it won't happen in that manner. The way it happens usually is the way it happened in this collapse, where there is an alternative and the general population takes a step back. It doesn't support a side in that conflict. But I think the Taliban are digging their own grave the way they're running the country, and they're taking people to that point. Whether that will come sooner or later, we'll have to see.
Other questions around the room? I did want to ask, you know, I fall prey to this problem as well. So, and there's only so much you can cover in a presentation. But, you know, I think a lot of what we narrate in contemporary global politics starts with the Trump administration. And of course, there were many things happening before the Trump administration. And I wonder if you could go back a little bit, thinking about just this, you know, going back to your actual presentation, the very idea of negotiating with the Taliban. Because I remember even in the Clinton administration, there was a moment where there was some discussion, I don't know how far it went, about should we recognize these guys now that they control whatever it was, 90% of Afghanistan's territory, right? And I don't know whether it was state or who, you know, who demurred on the issue. And then, you know, jumping a few steps ahead, you get to the Obama administration. Of course, you would expect, I would have expected Biden to be closer to Obama on issues of Afghanistan, but things had shifted already, right? Because you have in that period under Obama this sense that, well, the locus of terrorist activity has shifted. It's left, right? It's left this theater and it's gone somewhere else. Obviously, it can go back, which is why we want to keep troops there. But our major concern is now the Middle East, Syria, it's Iraq, and so on. And so, I guess, what would you bring into you know, from the pre-Trump era in order to make fuller sense of how Doha came about in the particular shape that it came about?
So I'd say two things. I think we were on the receiving end of Trump's business-like presidency, where he treated foreign policy like he would treat a startup company.
Remember, he wanted to buy Greenland.
Well, yeah. So I think, you know, that in itself is a whole field of study. Yeah. So institutions undermined in a massive scale. And then Biden just chose to stick the course. And the impression we have is that Biden was disillusioned with Afghanistan. And, you know, he was also of the belief that, you know, we just need to outsource this problem to Pakistan, let Pakistan handle Afghanistan the way it was in the 80s. That's always been the push of the Pakistani army. And, you know, they won. Mm-hmm. The Taliban did not win this war. Pakistan won this war. So I think in terms of the establishment position, was to start withdrawal and troop reduction. That's why the surge happened. And there was a negotiation of maybe perhaps looking at various options, cost reduction, long-term presence like South Korea, Japan, military bases in Europe. But, you know, Trump's whatever motivations took everybody in that specific direction. And so I think that the establishment position on Afghanistan ran its course. And we as a people failed to recognize that there's an expiration date. And we failed to make the best of this opportunity. So that is on us. That is on us. No one else to blame but us, where the entire world and their resources were there, and we were just busy trying to share the spoils and bickering over small things. A lot did happen. We, for the first time, developed a democratic constitution. we had access, we had representation. Of course, it could have been better. Of course, it could have improved. But these are not small things. We started actually building a country. But the same partner which helped us do it betrayed us. So the sense of betrayal is the strongest sensation that we have. And this betrayal is multi-layered. Maybe the one thing that I never thought that, I hadn't experienced this, is that being a part of a failure, because the collapse means you fail, you realize that everyone feels betrayed by everyone. Ashraf Ghani feels betrayed, Dr. Abdullah feels betrayed, soldiers and commandos feel betrayed, the Americans feel betrayed to an extent. And so that betrayal, unfortunately, is labeled under realpolitik, or interest shifting, or however you want to frame it diplomatically, but it's there. And I think a lot of this is analogous to how we see what's happening in Ukraine. And this is very early stages of, it's equivalent to how it was in early 2000s for us, where Afghanistan was a sexy topic. All right, Afghanistan, what's happening? Kandahar, Kabul. And then things started taking a different turn. And so some signs, they were seeing some signals. Joint Chiefs of Staff came out and said, our assessment shows that the Ukrainians cannot win this war. And then you see, Moscow talks happening, and then you see Ukrainian Zelensky constantly saying it. So Zelensky's a good guy. He's the good guy right now, but let's see how long he can stay the good guy. We don't know. And this might not be a popular opinion in this room or anywhere else, but I think Ukrainians are going to get a very rude awakening if they don't learn from other experiences, particularly from Afghanistan, that the world is not going to stick around. They're going to promise you a bunch of money, and that money is also it's just a facade. We were promised billions and billions of dollars. A lot of it, 80% of it, just went from one U.S. bank account to another U.S. bank account. Oh, U.S. spent $1 trillion. What $1 trillion? Go look at the country. What $1 trillion? We used to beg for money in funding and revenue.
Yeah, what's the official number? 2.3 trillion was
Well, it
spent.
depends on which report you. Some say up to 14, 15, if you include a lot of other expenses, but around that.
No, certainly the questions arise, and I guess maybe we should have a second seminar explicitly comparing the two. No, I think because there are a lot of instructive moments. Of course, the contexts are different, and so there are going to be factors that would play themselves out in different kinds of ways, potentially, or not. But at a minimum, highlighting the lessons that you find and throwing them at the Ukraine case, I think, is going to sensitize us to possibilities that we wouldn't have thought about, especially wrapped up in the moment that many of us are, where it's Zelensky's the good guy. Ukraine can do no wrong, and the money is well spent. Well, money is well spent until it's not well spent, right? And then things can potentially be different. But I'm still on Team Ukraine. Maybe it's too early.
No, we are. I think most are on Team.
Yeah, no, clearly. But just even technical questions like the following the money, right? Which became a bit of, I think, of an Achilles heel for the government in Afghanistan, right?
So.
The accountability question is something that's worth raising now, not as a way to slow down the flow of funds to Ukraine. Let me be very clear. I don't think that's a good idea, but as a way of ensuring even those, Republican skeptics in the US that this continues to be money well spent. There is accountability. It is going to the cause that we all can stand behind. And I think your remarks in a way point in that direction.
I hear of, and maybe this can be concluding remarks, I assume, if there are no more questions. I hear of people who are engaged in Ukraine, a lot of the same actors who are in Afghanistan, but I hear of, lavish parties, a lot of, money being thrown around on random projects, and it feels a lot like Kabul during the surge time, at least, where there was an injection of resources and funds The system wasn't ready to absorb, the system wasn't ready to process that, the system wasn't ready to actually spend that the way it should be spent. But politically, you couldn't look the other way. You had to keep the war going. But when you don't have to keep the war going, then you're like, all right, so, you know, where'd that money go? Where'd this shipment of weapons go? Where'd that go? And those stories are just in the pipeline, and they're going to come out. And they're not going to come out with the intention of reforming and correcting the system. I think that's the part that we have to recognize. They're going to come out as instruments to achieve a new agenda. And so the accusations of corruption in Afghanistan were not, okay, there's corruption, let's actually fix it. No, we do this, you do this, we identify people, we remove them. That was not the pursuing conversation. The corruption was that the conversation was that, oh, there's corruption, we have to reduce the number of troops. We're like, how are those two related? And so we're going to see a lot of this instrumentalized engagement happening in Ukraine. And the only way, I think, out of this for the Ukrainians is to you know, prepare for the worst case scenario, in my opinion. And I'm not sure if that is happening. Not privy to any information.
Okay, yeah, brief question, then we should probably wrap it up. Yeah.
Yes, well, congratulations for your speech. It was brilliant. Now that we are, well, carry on with the analysis of the situation, if you could come back, which are the main ideas that you tell, I don't know, the people negotiating in Doha or at that moment, what would you change?
First of all, the first thing I would change is that I would develop the courage to walk away from the talks publicly. The government was too afraid to walk away from the talks. That was the level of dependency, because if you walked away from the talks, then that would put Washington in a position where they would either have to justify, correct, or make another decision. That option was always there, but that option was never taken. I think that would have created some leverage for us. We had no leverage on the negotiating table. We had no leverage. That's one. The second thing was political unity. I think that the political actors were so polarized and unable to see the big picture that it made it an extremely easy situation scenario for the Taliban. And so I think the ability to unite political actors, again, would have created leverage. The third I mentioned earlier was we had burnt a lot of bridges with the region. I think we should have started re-engaging, because a neighbor is a neighbor. It doesn't matter who's in charge. When you have a physical border with a country, their relationship with you and engagement with you will take a much longer context into account compared to an intervention of a force halfway around the world. And so these would be the three things I think would have been done.
Well, obviously much more to talk about, but we're out of time. So I guess the only two things left. One is to invite you back for more conversation. And the second is to thank you for joining us today. So thank you guys. Thank you.